So without further ado, I will introduce Ed May, who informed me that he's actually Santa Claus. I should introduce him as Santa Claus. That he got his PhD in experimental nuclear physics at the University of Pittsburgh. He's the founder and president of Laboratories for Fundamental Research here in Palo Alto, and for 19 years he was involved with the Stargate program, using ESP and other mind technologies, would you call it? And that's what he's here to talk to us about, so please welcome Dr. Ed May.
Well, good evening. I hope you can all hear me. I like to shout, so hope you guys won't go deaf in the front row. First off, I'd like to thank Judy and Jerry and Mary, who's in the back there, for inviting me to talk to you all this evening. I hope the warm invitation will still last at the end of my talk, rather than riding me out of town on a rail. Before we begin, I'd like to announce we have a celebrity here tonight, Russell Targ. Russell Targ was one of the co-founders of this program. So if you have any serious questions about the program, don't ask me, ask him. Okay, tonight I'm going to tell you 2.5 stories. The 2 stories are really different from one another. One is whatever happened to Stargate, which was the last nickname for the government spying program. The second half of the program of my talk tonight will be a physical model and neuropsychological model of precognition itself. And then one slide about Stargate Archive. My colleague and I are putting together all of the work that was done in the 20-year program as about a 5 or 6 volume set, an enormous amount of work. Full disclosure, which I talked to Mary about over lunch, I am a little bit different than probably most of you. I will admit to being a hard-nosed materialist atheist. My wife taught women's spirituality at down the street here a little ways, what used to be called Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, and she taught the women's spirituality program. And she would have me come give lectures in her research class and introduce me as her husband, the atheist materialist husband of hers, and there would be an audible gasp and discover I really wasn't the enemy after all. But at least you should know that's the sort of flavor of which we're going to be talking about tonight. Okay, let me start this. Try to start it here. Oh, it doesn't too bad. All right, first the authors. You heard a little introduction about myself. I spent a lot of time in India. I did my PhD work in low energy nuclear physics. Not quite that low, but pretty low energy anyway. It had nothing to do with this program, although a lot of the statistics and a lot of the research methodology that I was able to bring to this program when Russell and Hal invited me to join them still holds true today. My partner in crime is Sonali Marwa. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology with an emphasis in neuropsychology, and she lives in India with this lovely view of the beach, and we work closely together, and in fact she's the first author on the model. And you'll see why in a bit. I travel to India once or twice a year, and we meet and talk and work things out. We have this amazingly intellectual conversation. I mean, it's part of my thrilling, and I want to show you the background in which we hold these intellectual conversations at an ice cream parlor. I mean, ice cream is one of the best induction mechanisms for critical thinking. Okay, outline. First I'm going to show you a short video, and I hope we can get the audio to work for you. Secondly, we'll talk about the Stargate, Russians and Americans spying on each other with remote viewing during that period of time for about $22 million. I think that's a little bit high. Then we'll talk about a 1-slide program, one view graph of the Stargate archive, 8 to 10 volumes of all the Stargate material. It is a magnificently terrible job to take these governmentese documents and convert them into something anybody can bother reading about without changing anything in them. We will then finish up with a test model about how precognition might work. So I ask you all please to buckle your seatbelts. We're off for a giant run. Micro-history. Well, so please forgive me, I'm going to talk about a 20-year program in one slide. The U.S. government support application research and extrasensory perception, SRI, in these years roughly about that amount of money. We then switched it over to Science Applications International Corporation, which is another defense contractor in all those years. And Hal and Russ were here for these particular periods. And I joined in '76, became the director, fell in my lap from 1985 to 1995, director of the research part. And all of the research was declassified in 1989. And finally, my first visit to the Soviet Union was in 1992. I've now been there about 20 times, which leads me to an unabashed marketing pitch. On the back table there are 3 flyers to advertise these books. These books are not for sale, they're mine. So you can look at them, but don't walk out the door with them, please. The one that's really readable is called ESP Wars, East and West. And that's a story, sometimes quite funny, that I co-authored with my former KGB adversaries of what we were doing to them and what they were doing to us. It's very funny reading, and we've had a lot of time chatting about it, and you'll see some pictures of these guys later on. The second book here is called Anomalous Cognition. This has won an award. It was on Amazon for about 1 week, and it was granted an international award. I'm not joking. By the International Insomniac Association. This book will put you right to sleep in no time. The serious part of it is it's a collection of research papers, highly geeky, and pretty unreadable unless you're a statistics buff. And finally, I think the best of the 3 books. This is a 2-volume set my colleague Sonali and I edited with 38 different authors across the field of what's going on in Australia, what's going on in the UK or Europe, and what's going on in the US in terms of extrasensory perception research. And then all of volume 2 is about theories. What are the theories associated with anomalous cognition, we call it. So have a look if you have time. The flyers are back there. Just pick them up and at your leisure. Okay. This program had, because of its controversy, had more oversight than a test dummy at a dentist convention. One of these, we had 3 committees, on-site Army colonel and a high-ranking defense intelligence officer, Jim Saliger, the late Jim Saliger. We had what is called an inverse file drawer. I don't know if any of you know what the file drawer problem is in academic research. It means you do a study, it doesn't work, you stick it in the file drawer and you don't publish it. That's why it's called the file drawer. We have an inverse version of that. We have things we haven't published that work beautifully. So that will appear in this large archive. Sufficient resources and critical mass of people and top-of-the-line consultants. Substantial scientific progress. This is a little video to put into context what remote viewing is about if you've not seen it. This was Joe McMonagle, some of you know. The program was called Put to the Test, an ABC national program. U.S. National ABC Television in '95. It's a real-time remote viewing. It is not faked. They spent $150,000 on this 20-minute segment. This part is 11 minutes long. And please pray, let's hope this works.
Extrasensory perception,
Yes.
ESP. We've all heard of someone who says they have it, and scientists from around the world have spent decades trying to explain it. Well, you're about to meet a man who claims to possess this extraordinary ability. It's allowed us to put him to the test.
For most of his adult life, Joe McMonagle was a professional soldier. 2 brutal tours of Vietnam, U.S. Army intelligence, a Legion of Merit award winner, a black and white world, clearly defined and limited to his 5 senses. But in 1970, Joe claims that world was turned inside out. In a restaurant, Joe suddenly felt ill and staggered outside. This is the first time he's told his story on television.
There was sort of a pop, and I found myself standing on a cobblestone road watching the rain go through my hands, and looked up and saw my body sort of half in, half out of the doorway. I knew at that point that I was probably dead.
Joe was rushed to a hospital, where he arrived showing no signs of life.
I felt as though I was falling backwards and was enveloped by a white light.
So here you are, you've almost died, and then all these strange things start happening to you. What's going through your mind?
It shattered all my concepts of reality. I started having spontaneous out-of-bodies. I'd lay down for a nap on the couch or something, and I just find myself suddenly out of my body, somewhere else, totally.
Joe also claims he started having other unexplainable experiences, like knowing what complete strangers were thinking. For 8 years, he kept his extrasensory perceptions to himself. Unbeknownst to Joe, 3,000 miles across the country, this man, Dr. Edwin May, and a select group of investigative scientists were just beginning to study extrasensory perception, ESP.
When I first got involved with this, I was very skeptical. I said, if this is real, it's critically important. After 20 years, I've come to the conclusion something interesting is going on.
How do you study ESP in the lab? Well, scientists developed an experiment called remote viewing. The person being tested is placed in a closed room. A researcher then goes to an unknown location, and the subject is asked to use ESP to draw what that researcher is seeing. Over the past 20 years, Dr. May has conducted thousands of these remote viewing experiments. In 1978, he started testing Joe McMoneagle, and Dr. May claims Joe has drawn scores of unknown sights, 50% of the time with remarkable and unexplainable success.
In one of his best hits, we had a person that was in the administration building at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And all Joe drew was the laboratory, perfect plan view of what this laboratory looks like. The interesting thing is, Joe's never been to Livermore. And this person could have been hiding anywhere in the entire continental USA. We've looked in the laboratory to figure out what's special about Joe. We've looked medically, neurophysiologically, physically, behaviorally, in every way one can look at a human being. And the good news is Joe is boringly normal like the rest of us. Well, what we are proposing is that there is a sixth, an additional sense, that is responsible for what Joe does in the laboratory and in the real world.
Does Joe McMoneagle actually have a sixth sense, a sense which cannot be explained? To test his abilities, we flew him here to Houston, a city to which he's never been. For Joe, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. The needle, a random location. The haystack, the 5,436 square miles that make up Greater Houston. We hired a movie location scout who spent 5 days finding a wide variety of distinct target sites.
I think all of them have dramatic Houston elements with very defined architectural styles. And, one of the things that I did not want to do is repeat any common denominator. I did not want there to be 2 archways. I didn't want there to be 2 triangles in the visual.
Following Dr. May's scientific protocol, the producers reduced the hundreds of possible sites down to 4. A life-size treehouse on the George Ranch. A visually dramatic portion of the theme park Astro World. The ship channel at the Port of Houston Authority. And a famous local landmark, the water wall. Without Joe's knowledge, those locations were photographed and placed in numbered envelopes at our downtown headquarters. We hired Officer Bill Baker of the Houston Police Department to retain custody of those envelopes. With Joe McMoneagle sequestered in a windowless, soundproof room, we placed the 4 numbered envelopes in an adjacent room. To choose our final location, Julie Wiesen, a local marketing executive, was asked to roll the dice.
So the number is 2. So Officer Baker, why don't you take envelope number 2?
For the test, we selected Jessica Miller from the Houston Visitors Bureau to be what the scientists call the target person. Inside envelope number 2 was the photograph of the Houston ship channel. It would be Jessica's job to go to the target site and carefully observe every detail. In theory, through ESP, Joe might actually be able to see the location through Jessica's eyes. We would simultaneously record both Jessica and Joe. So while they drove, Joe began what he calls his cool-down period, similar to meditation, clearing his mind of all outside distractions. After 30 minutes, it was time for our test to begin. I had no knowledge of any of the locations.
We have been radioed that our crew and our target person are now on site. So I'm going to show you a picture.
This is our target person. Have you ever seen her before?
No, I've never seen her before.
Describe for us the environment that she's in.
For television purposes, we've condensed the 15-minute session. Remember, these are the 4 locations in the envelopes. But all Joe knows is that the location is anywhere in Greater Houston.
First impression I'm getting is kind of a, I'm going to call it a river for lack of a better name. My sense is that it's both natural and man-made, so there's probably been something done to this river. It's been dredged or seawalls, formal walls of some kind.
I didn't know it, but within moments, with just a few strokes of his pen, Joe had eliminated not only our 3 other locations, but the infinite number of possible sites around Houston. Now the question became, how detailed could he get?
Many vertical lines that are perpendicular one to the other, but the horizontal lines seem to have curves to them. And the actual target itself is more on an incline.
Remember, at this moment, Joe is attempting to see what Jessica is seeing.
Well, she's looking up. So there's something tall at the target. Keeps looking up at it. I want to say there's like a bridge nearby. My sense is the bridge isn't meant for traffic, not meant for people.
As you're going through this process, is this confined just to visual?
Some of it's visual, but some of it's also hearing or smells or taste or just sensations.
Towards the end of Joe's session, a huge cargo ship docked right in the middle of our location, dramatically altering the target site.
I'm just getting a lot of metallic noise. There's something else down here as well. It's a very, very large object. I don't think it's a building. I don't know what that is. But this is a very large object. Something tall behind the part of the entry. And then I get sort of almost a specifically designed platform. I get a feeling like there's a black stripe down the center of it or something. This is about probably all I'm going to get on this target.
It was now time to go to the target site. Remember, Joe's impressions included a bridge, a river improved by man, seawalls, a very large object, and lots of metallic noise. When we arrived, we met Jessica, and unbelievably, we saw what she saw. A bridge, a river improved by man, a very large object, and a barge used for dredging.
This is scary. Take a look at that. And then take a look at the barge in the water and the shape of that.
Which looks exactly like it's talked about.
Were you looking at that during the
I looked at that a lot because I, looked all down in that direction, so I did
This
look
is
at
the
it a lot.
What really impresses me is large object. And I'm looking at this ship, and I can't believe it, because that's right on the nose. Now, in terms of the bridge, you said you thought it was more foot traffic than automobile.
That's obviously something got twisted in the interpretation. Generally speaking, about 80% of what I do say usually turns out to be correct.
Are you pleased with the way this turned out?
Yeah, I'm pleased. I think out of all the places that we could have been around Houston, this is very much fits the picture of the area.
About 20% of what Joe does is as close to spectacular as I could possibly wish. Scientists don't like to use the term miracle very often, but this is as close to one as you can imagine.
Coincidence, chance, or an extrasensory ability that exists in all of us. If you were skeptical, like I was, then perhaps what Joe McGonigal accomplished today opened all of our minds just a bit. Reporting from the Houston Ship Channel, I'm Bill McAtee.
There's a couple of backstories to this. First off, it looks like he did that remote viewing in real time. When it was all finished, he called me up and he was exhausted. This was the first time he had ever done anything like this on television. Since then, he's done over 200 of them in countries all around the world. He and I have done work together in Hungary and in Moscow, but he's done a lot in Japan and Germany and every country you can think of, real live remote viewing on camera. What's interesting about this particular thing, he said, if you think I'm going to do remote viewing live on camera for the first time, you're full of it. He did all the remote viewing over breakfast in the hotel. And what you saw him doing was just recalling his experience from the hotel, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay. This is a site map of the program called Stargate. We had three primary tasks. One is intelligence collection, spying, if you will. And underneath each of these things are some of the problems associated. How do you integrate spying information, remote viewing style, into the broader community? That's one question. How do we collect the data with remote viewing when we're, quote, spying? And lastly, how do we know we have anything real before you actually act on it? And is it sufficiently good to act on it? Or how do you analyze it when you're all done? The second thing you had to worry about, if we could spy on them, guess what? They could spy on us. And so an awful lot of work we called foreign threat assessment, which in the early days, I'm sure Russell will share my frustration that we couldn't have much research to do because we hid some of the research under the foreign assessment. Soviets claimed they were doing this and so, we'll give it a try in the lab and see whether it's real or not. And finally, research of two types. One is called the applied research. That is, to heck with how it actually works, what do we do to improve the output product? Stand on your head in the corner, give Ian M&Ms for feedback or something of that nature, which included countermeasures. Can we hide what we're doing from the Soviets? And lastly, there was some basic research, and I won't go through all of these things. These are just some of the basic research things that we did during the course of the program. I promise you, there is not one statistic in this entire presentation and not one graph. So you all can relax. There's a lot. If you're interested in that, hey, I could, never mind. Okay, overlying all of this was more oversight than you can imagine. I started to say what that is. But even on top of that was this, politic. And I know in my time as director, I probably spent 40% of my research time, doing this. It's still going on today, I might add, the politic part of it. Okay, early operations, location for Stargate. Early operations and all the research in SRI was from 1972, I believe, to 1989. I later went to Science Application International in 1990 to 1995. All the operations from 1978 to 1995 were done at Fort Meade, Maryland. There are a lot of unclassified nicknames for this project. Gondola Wish is one, Fish Fry, Sunstreak, Center Lane, Quantum Leap. There's a story about that. I was walking out of the Pentagon with the colonel in the Army, and he said, Ed, hey, great, we got a whole new code name for your program. It's called Quantum Leap. Aren't you excited? And I said, well, no, actually. A quantum leap progress is the smallest possible progress you can have above none. I said, couldn't we have a different one? But it's stuck anyway. And then finally, Grill Flame and Stargate. With regard to Grill Flame, I had a program for a random number generator experiment with the Army Missile Command at Redstone Army Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And my contract monitor was a guy named Billy Jenkins. His name was not William or Bill, it was Billy Jenkins. And he spoke with a heavy Alabama accent. I was completely convinced with my bias that he couldn't have a brain in his head. Turned out he was the smartest guy I ever met in government. Just a magnificent man. And he was going to go to the Pentagon in a week, and it was before PowerPoint. He went to the audiovisual department at the Army there and said, I'm doing remote viewing, that's what it's about, and the code name is Grow Flag. And here's what the loving, kinder, gentler Army came up with. And I said, wait a minute. No, time out. You don't get to use this slide, but he gave it to me and he didn't actually use it. Okay, support from the U.S. Senate. That's Senator Claiborne Pell, the late senator from Rhode Island, was very instrumental and important in our project, supportive of us. That's Dale Graff right here, one of the project monitors, and these are top secret classified safes at Fort Meade. And that's the lovely building in which this all took place at Fort Meade. It was a crummy, falling down 1940 style World War II, crappy looking place from the outside with no signs on it at all at Fort Meade, Maryland. But that's what it looks like inside. It's pretty nice. Oh, wow. And there's a couple of extra rooms, and the commander had his own room, and you can see lots of safes here on this side and on that side. It was a very comfortable environment. There was a second building in which they did the remote viewing. I don't have a picture of that. Formerly secret program. We take this stuff deadly serious, and I am proud to have been part of that, a small contribution in preventing us from going to war with the Soviets. You can't fight a war unless you have secrets. So I was doing some work in this very classified work at Fort Meade. And Joe and I went to the Soviet Union, and it took us a hell of a long time to go there because he insisted on riding on his pet steed. That's at the Moscow Zoo. I don't think that's an alive animal, but nonetheless. Okay, I mentioned Scientific Oversight Committee. This is a partial list. There were 12 at the heyday, and I'm not going to read all of this to you, but some of these are the who's who of science and in the country. And the entrance requirement to be on this test, on this group, was that you had to profess skepticism of the phenomenon, but willing to be open-minded about it. And one I'll point out here, this guy, Mel Schwartz is his name, the late Mel Schwartz, got a Nobel Prize in physics, and he and I were friends and colleagues and physics partners and business partners, and when he got the prize, I called him up and said, hey Mel, how would you like to be on our oversight committee? He said, Ed, you know, I think it's all BS, why do you want me? And I said, well, the real answer is because you have a Nobel Prize that looks good on this slide. And he said, well, okay. But I then said, but you're an honest scientist and I respect your science. He said, all right, if I do it for a year and decide at the end of that time it's all BS, then what? And I said, if you can convince the other members of the committee that it's all BS, I will quit and go to work for you at Brookhaven National Lab. He said, great, we're done. I said, we're not close to done. He said, what are you talking about? I said, what if, after watching us for a year and talking to the other members of the committee, you think something's really in this that's worthy of study? I caught him up short, and finally he said, okay, I will spend some fraction of my career helping you to figure out how it worked, and he did that almost within the year of his death. Okay, a second committee. Believe it or not, the military has a much more stringent regulation with regard to the protection of humans in experiments, more stringent than the health and human sciences. And so we had to constitute our own, and all these people had to be classified, had to have clearance rather. And there's some who's who people in the U.S. Medical business. And I'll call your attention here. The rules say we have to have a member of a clergy. So we had a Buddhist monk who had a secret clearance. We didn't get it for him, but this guy named Nakasone was a Buddhist monk representing the spiritual aspect of this program. It's really nice. And finally, there was a policy oversight with some of the who's who in the Department of Defense, whose sole job was to keep us honest with regard to the mission working for the DoD. Okay, comment and oversight. Our program was tiny for a DoD program, yet we had more oversight than programs 100 times larger because everybody was scared of the dreaded Golden Fleece Award by Senator Proxmire. So they were concerned that we were fooling them, and we were concerned that we might be fooling ourselves. So we had all this oversight, and it was really something. I didn't tell you what the Scientific Oversight Committee had to do. They reviewed our protocols before we did anything. They had drop-in privileges unannounced, And at the end of each year, they came to SRI for 2 days of fighting with us. The good news is we won about 85% of those fights. Great news. The better news is with the 15% we lost because it improved our output in enormous ways. For my sort of academic style career, that was the high point, dealing with these people. Okay, demonstrates high interest in the program. This does not usually mean favorable. The government tried to shut us down at every chance you can think of, except for a handful of magnificent heroes who stood in the way between us and them, kept us alive. Often Pete tried to put us out of business, and I said that. Here are a group of reviews that were done beginning in 1977 all the way through. There's a color code up here. Some are good results, some of them are mixed. Some of them are the Office of Secretary of Defense. Basically, this stuff is real. Okay, at the time I put this slide together, the CIA had not released 89,000 pages of formerly classified work. So I took this out of the newspaper from Washington Post at that date. And here are some 3 operational things that were done spying. And we're going to talk about this one, Joe McMonagle's famous submarine, which you may have already heard about. So here's another movie.
A former Army officer, Joe McMonagle was part of a top-secret research program run by the Defense Intelligence Agency and CIA for over 20 years. Only recently declassified, the Stargate project examined a variety of phenomena, especially one known as remote viewing.
Remote viewing means the ability to remotely perceive information about a person, place, event, object that you have absolutely no access to through any other means except via the mind.
Beginning in the 1950s, the United States government explored the use of extrasensory perception for intelligence operations, with officials worried that the Soviets were ahead in the psychic arms race. Joe had already developed a reputation for his intuitive powers.
When you use the ability for so many years, you inherently begin to trust it more than you do other people because you're applying it on a day-to-day basis.
McMonagle claims he was then given a real target. The National Security Council wanted to know more about what was happening inside a huge new building in the north of the Soviet Union at Severodvinsk, a port on the White Sea.
I was asked to describe what was going on under the roof of this building. And the image I had was of 2 very large cylinders being welded together. I saw canted missile tubes. I saw a unique drive system. And all of this was taking place next to a standard-sized submarine, which I found to be dwarfed next to the size of this one that was under construction. It was absolutely huge. The first precognitive remote viewing that I did after I got angry, actually. There was an admiral in the National Security Council who brought my remote viewing back to me and said that they basically did not believe that there was a submarine being built in a building in Severodvinsk, Russia. It made me very angry. They said they didn't believe it because the building was 1,000 meters from the sea. I said, go back and tell them they're going to launch it in 114 days. And the Typhoon-class submarine was launched from the building within 7 days of my prediction.
That particular submarine was the basis behind the movie Hunt for the Red October. There's only one of them left. They've all been taken out of service. It so happens the one that's left was the one that he saw. And when I was in one of my trips to Moscow, I met the designer of that boat. And he said something I don't believe, but what he said was, we knew our boat had been compromised by remote viewing. That's the biggest load of you-know-what, imagine. But we now have permission to go on that boat with the film crew. My wife is somewhat terrified because I want to go under the ice cap, and of course we won't do that. So I have a couple more examples here of what the Operation Remote Viewing looks like. What's so interesting to me is from the CIA released documents, I have the actual geographical coordinates of some things. And I then can go to, and here's another one, a rocket test in Utah and an airfield in Iran. And what I'm able to do is to go to Google Earth today, and surprisingly enough, 30 to 35 years later, the stuff is still there. That surprises me. Here's some example. This is hard to read, so basically Ingo Swan was the viewer here, and he drew stuff like that, said there's an airport here, and I'll show you what the feedback looks like. This pin is a geographical coordinate, and what you see here is, I said there's a river, there's an interesting shaped building, and a city about northwest nearby, and this city is about 3.8 kilometers northwest of the airport. That's about the quality you can expect for this kind of data collection. Russ, were you the monitor with Hella on this?
What, this is the linear accelerator?
No, this is the rocket test in Utah.
I was not.
Okay, maybe Hal was. Anyway, it was a rocket test motor, and what Hella said was it looks like a steam engine, and it kicks up with a rainmaking machine here, and this is a stylized drawing of what it looked like for feedback, and here is a Google Earth shot of what it looks like today, the same exact thing. And she said there was a lot of dust and smoke being kicked up. Rain-making machine, that's off the internet. They spray water on these rocket motors to keep them from overheating. And lastly, Ingo did this remote viewing of an airbase or airfield in Iran, except he didn't write and draw. He cut out construction paper and glued it as an image. So that gives you some idea what this looks like. Here is a government evaluation in 1983, declassified document written by Jim Salyer, put off Leslie DeBell, and it's about operational remote viewing. And basically it says, hey, this stuff's pretty good. Joe McMonagle was given the Legion of Merit Award, which is rarely given out to non-commissioned officers. He's a warrant officer for his work in excellence in remote viewing spying. He had over 200 missions, 150 essential elements of information, briefed at this alphabet soup. Doesn't say there, but it was also briefed to the West Wing of the White House. Keep in mind the CIA said this wasn't useful. Somebody laughing? This is serious matter. Okay. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Busby. Russ, I don't think you've seen this. This is one slide of a lengthy briefing that Busby gave to somebody in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Keep in mind the CIA said no way in hell was this ever useful as an intelligence gathering procedure.
Why? Why is that being said, apparently?
Why they said that?
Yeah,
you have to ask them. I have no idea about their motivation. Okay, so at this time there were 700 missions, and their assessment is 85% of the remote viewing data of that 700 missions were accurate with regard to remote viewing, and here's the kicker. 45% of it had high value for intelligence. So much for the CIA. I want to show of hands. I didn't get a chance to put a non-disclosure statement out together, but I'm about to show you something that has never been seen in the public domain. So if you raise your hand, we all promise to keep it to yourselves. It's a big, giant secret. Come on, hands up, hands up. You lazy guys. Theoretical physicists with powers of ESP stealing a thought experiment from a colleague. Okay, that is my now good friend over a decade, General Alexei Yurovich Savin. In his finery with too many medals on his chest. He ran the Russian remote viewing program in Chechnya and at the time of the Soviet Union and later under Russia. This is what he looks like today. He's retired. When he retired, I wrote him a letter and said, hey, Alexei, since you've retired, why don't we write a book together? So it tells what the Russians were doing against us and what we were doing against the Russians. And what's so interesting here is part of the Russian remote viewing group. These are remote viewers. And Joe was with us on this trip. And this is a very top remote viewer, a woman named Elena Klimova. And here's Savin with a number of remote viewers. At the height of their program, they had 120 remote viewers. At best, we had 12.
Wow.
And so I said, hey, Alexei, you like the women in your program? He says, why not? Now, what's different between their training and our training is they were given hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, hand-to-hand combat training. There's Elena Klimova, and here's Joe and Elena that did remote viewing together. So I said, hey, Alexei, what is it about remote viewing you don't understand? You don't need to take these people and put them in harm's way in Chechnya. And he said, it sharpens their abilities. I'll bet. Now, you may notice a pin right here. There's a large view of it. This is the pin on the romantic name 10,003, which was the classified remote viewing group within the Army and intelligence community in the Soviet Union. And I am a proud member as Joe McMonagle. I'll pass this around, but I would like to have it back. Okay. So what's happening now? Well, the short answer is nothing. I hope that's wrong, but I believe that's the case. Not for a lack of trying, 10 years of effort with no avail. Couldn't get anybody to budge on this program after the CIA closed it. Tried many avenues of approach, joint effort with the Russian military. Savin asked me to please take lots of pictures of him. He said, I know you're going to write up a contact and intelligence report, and I will cooperate with you, give you anything you want, take it to your military people. I want a joint program with you on a common problem called counterterrorism. I wrote up a 30-page paper and handed it to the 3-star admiral in charge of DIA at the time, Admiral Wilson. And he said, thank you very much, and never heard from him again. Okay, I said that already. All right, conclusion. Stargate is dead. Near future stargates are unlikely. Richard Burton has pointed out that we believe what we believe, not because of reason, but because of emotions in the limbic system of our brain. Robert Burton has written a hell of a great book if you want to know about how we come to some conclusions, especially when they're not right. Progress on the research side. We have all struggled to get good research results into the mainstream. Professor Daryl Bem and others have opened the door a crack. But even if we have to fight, even he had to fight, and has suffered silly attacks in the media and science publications. But lately we've made some inroads into the mainstream. That's the mainstream if you didn't know what Okay, a one-slide thing of what we're doing now called the Stargate Archive. It's almost 1.14 million words spread across now 5 volumes. It looks like it's growing. And I have a contract with McFarland Press in North Carolina to publish this work. It's a huge amount of work. If you look here, just the number of figures, that alone, to make camera ready is a huge job. Number of equations, tables, and so on. This is the number of words. It's a monumental effort, but I think it's good for archival purposes. It'll go into the library, so 50 years from now, someone will be able to figure out what the heck we did. Okay, we switched gears. I may rush this and go through some slides. This is a multiphasic model of precognition. My colleague, Sonali Patmarwa, is the lead author. She deserves it. The main part of this is what we do is divide up the problem space of precognition. How in the world does the information get from tomorrow in New York to here now? That is a physics problem. We call that the physics domain. Once it's here, how it gets into the nervous system we're not sure about, but once it's in there, we call that the neuroscience domain. This will be pictures to see what it looks like. We define precognition, just in case you're not familiar with the term, is defined as an atypical perceptual ability that allows the acquisition of non-inferential information arising from a future point in space-time. The observables. Information originating some distant point in space-time becomes available to a participant. Eventually, it's reported as some form of cognition. That's a precognition experiment trial. Reductionist approach, that's our approach. We have divided up the problem space in two non-overlapping domains. I've already mentioned this. There must be some transducer to connect the two. What connects the information coming in to the brain? It's very much like the retina, psychic retina, if you will, takes information coming into your eyes and puts it into a form that the brain can understand. Here's the physics domain. We have a transducer. We have some cortical hyperassociation mechanism. I'll tell you more about that in a bit. And eventually cognition. Now, I've taken this picture and broken it up in pieces, which indicates the kind of problems we have in remote viewing. It's very hard, not impossible, but hard for people to, they may get elements of the sight, and they're not good at gluing them together as a coherent picture. That's what I tried to indicate by that. And this is the neuroscience domain and the physics domain. Okay. The physics domain. It comes into here, and regardless of mechanism, it does not depend upon any characteristics of that person. That person could be an atheist, a Buddhist monk, a stockbroker, or a skeptic. Or, Sonali made me take this out, that's her daughter. What follows is a plausibility argument for the mechanism in the physics domain, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you about it. So here's another movie, I'll let someone else tell you about it. Involves a concept called entropy. And so instead of trying to tell you all about entropy, I'll let Brian Green do it. He does a much better job.
We all know what will happen if I drop this glass of wine. Now, the idea that this mess could somehow reverse itself and form back into a solid glass filled with wine seems absurd. But according to the laws of physics, this can happen. All I need to do is reverse the velocities of everything. Every piece of glass, every drop of wine, every molecule and atom in the liquid, glass, table, and air. Just reverse all their velocities. And voila! So, if the laws of physics don't care about whether glass is shatter or unshatter, why don't we ever see them unshatter? How can we square the laws of physics with our everyday experience? Something must be missing in our understanding, but what? What's responsible for the arrow of time? Like many good mysteries, this one leads us to a graveyard in our search for clues. In Vienna, near the final resting places of Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, and Strauss, is 19th century Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann's tombstone. Etched on top is an elegant equation, S equals K log W. It's the mathematical formulation of a powerful concept known as entropy. Entropy is a measure of something that we're all familiar with, disorder or randomness, and it's an important idea because there's a tendency of everything in the universe to move from order to disorder. Here's a way to get a feel for the idea. Take my book, all 569 pages of it. It's very ordered, with the first page followed by the second, followed by the third, and so on. But now, let's tear the pages out and let entropy go to work. As you can see, the pages become very disordered, and the reason is simple. There is only one way for them to land in order, but a huge number of ways for them to land out of order. And so it's much more likely that they'll land in a total mess. And this is what we experience in our daily lives. Things move from order to disorder. In this case, from a neat ordered book to pages that are randomly scattered. everywhere we look, we see examples of entropy or disorder increasing with the passage of time. An egg breaks and splatters. Ice cubes lose their orderly shape as they melt into water. Billowing smoke becomes increasingly disordered.
Ordered states become disordered states. And that appears to be perhaps the direction of an arrow of time.
We see sort of degrees of messiness, a measure of disorder, tend to increase in one direction of time.
And so that, for Boltzmann, begins to create an arc of time.
So maybe this is the answer. Maybe the arrow of time comes from the tendency of nature to evolve toward ever greater disorder.
Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. That's entropy. Okay, first the data. Inspiration. A class of spying missions never failed. That is, there are lots that did fail, but there was a class that didn't. What were they? That's one of them. There were no airdrop tests, but underground nukes. Underground nukes, large changes of thermodynamic entropy, electromagnetic pulse devices, rocket test motor things like you saw. And so we did a paper describing all this. If anybody's interested in looking these things up, please see me afterwards. 7 laboratory studies show a persistent correlation with changes of entropy of the target system with the quality of the remote viewing associated with that. And I forgot to introduce my dear colleague, Lori Hawley in the back row. We've just completed a 2-year study manipulating the entropy at the target site. She was out there pouring liquid nitrogen into a bucket, hopefully not into her shoes, at half the sites. Thank you, Lori. Preliminary results of the study I just told you about were very promising. The final report is in, and although mixed, it was very, very encouraging. Entropy and implication for anomalous cognition. Changes of entropy connect bidirectional time at the microscopic level to the apparent single direction at the level we all live in. Anomalous cognition, in particular precognition, seems to correlate with changes of entropy and the target stimuli and not with the entropy itself. Just like a sensory system. I don't know if you know that about our sensory systems. They're all changes. They're more sensitive to things that are changing at their front ends rather than steady state. You can see a blinking light far more easily than you can one that's steady. That's the same with your ears and your nose. Somebody walks in the room with too much cologne, you notice it immediately, and eventually you get used to it. It's called habituation. Same kind of a thing. And ESP apparently does the same thing. I won't show you the graphs that involved with that. Herein is a potential clue, say us. Correlation for the physics domain, criteria for the physics domain. No examples of information transfer which one can do work, in other words, use the information that do not have some concomitant energy carrier. You're hearing me, and I can convince you to go do something, like bring me a glass of water, because the air is compressing and hits your eardrum. So that's the carrier of that information. You listen to the radio going home. You decide to take a different route because of the traffic. And when you do that, that's information carried on E&M waves. The putative energy carrier above must be capable of propagating from the future to the present. Whoops, big problem. Entropy and or multi-dimensions may provide a solution. It's written in chapter 2, or book 2 of that series. In current cosmology, the concept of entropy has been gaining ground. Much to my surprise, there's a guy named Fairland from Amsterdam University in Holland, and basically what he says is, we need to replace gravity with an entropic force. And for those psychologists in the crowd, you know, I think there's a whole new area of psychology opening up having to do with identity crisis. It wasn't long ago when the planet Pluto was downgraded from a planet to something else. And now they're thinking about changing gravity to something else. Oh my God. A whole new area open up for it. Given a force that's acting through some distance, that's called an energy. And maybe, just maybe, waving my hands furiously, that might be the mechanism that's going on here. Entropy gradients have been used extensively in other forms of real research other than ESP, and I just give one example there from the acoustic world. Now here it really gets crazy. Here are some references to intimidate you all, which includes me, because I can't understand those papers either. But the point is, these are mainstream cosmology papers that are talking about a way of getting information from the future to the present. Dare I say this, and my colleagues kill me when I say this, through time entanglement through a wormhole. But, turns out, as odd as this sounds, Murray Gell-Mann said, in quantum mechanics, everything not forbidden is compulsory. So none of that really weird physics is actually forbidden. It may be compulsory, doesn't mean it has to happen all the time, but at least the door is slightly open for a lot smarter people than we are, my colleagues and I, to try to solve this problem. Physics domain conclusions. Although the concept of entropy and the error of time and information are connected, these notions are highly speculative at this moment as candidates for the physics domain part of the model. What is the carrier of precognitive information is even more speculative. Once the information is present in present time, how it gets into the central nervous system, the brain, remains a major mystery. And the requirements for a transducer, what converts that energy coming into something the brain can understand, an even bigger mystery. So you may wonder, why am I wasting your time? This is nothing but mystery. It gets better, I promise. The neuroscience domain. This is the neuroscience domain. We're going to go through it in some detail here. Considerations for the neuroscience domain. Information from a distant space-time point. All of our normal perceptions information come from objects coming in from the sensory system. I don't know if you know the name David Eagleman. Look him up on YouTube. He's got a great program called Sensory Substitution Devices and Extending Human Sensory Things. He proposes that the brain doesn't care at all from where it gets its information. And so the brain is kind of an interesting computer, and he gives a very interesting show about that. No apparent reason why anomalous AC perception should be any different than that. I'm a lazy researcher. If I don't have to throw anything out, I'm not going to. And if I eventually have to throw something out, it's doing kicking and screaming because I absolutely have to. So I'm going to stick with that for a while. Information from the future comes to a precipitant. The information is now. A lot of our colleagues think of this as non-local communication. Well, if you're sitting on the beach watching the sunset, no one considers that non-local communication to the sun. Back in Hindu mythology, they thought in those days that the sensory systems went out and gathered the information, even your visual systems, and brought it back. We now know differently than that. But a lot of my colleagues feel that we're dealing here with non-local information, that somehow some aspect of our consciousness reaches across space-time, gathers the information, and comes back. I don't think that's a requirement. If we solve the physics domain problem, it's a local phenomenon. It's right here in front of your nose. You don't have to worry about all of this stuff. And it sounds impossible. One of the contributors in this series is a mainstream philosopher from Australia named Richard Corey. And he argues quite convincingly that precognition does not violate causality. What is causality? This thing can't drop unless until I open my fingers. I'm not going to do it. It won't drop before I open my fingers. That's the rough notion of what we all think about causality. From a person's perspective, the information is available here and now. Okay, some fundamental points for psi-ability. Psi is a pan-human ability. However, it is not a universal human ability, such as emotions, which are universal to the species and perhaps even across species. Individuals can vary in their psi skill level, obviously. The performance is influenced by health and emotion status, any medications or stress levels, like everything else we do. So it's no big surprise that this stuff depends upon that sort of thing. What is hyper-associative cortical mechanism seen as synesthets? Synesthets are people that experience synesthesia, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Permits processing extended bandwidth signal coming from who knows where. And that means hyperconnectivity in the brain is a big hot topic in neuroscience these days, but you'll see it here. The synesthesia-like hypersociated mechanism accounts for the lack of uniformity in solubility across population, because not everybody can do this. Only a very small percentage. We had to account why it is we are now all not walking around Joe McMonagles. We all have some ability, like I can make a sound on the violin which would cause you running and screaming out of the room, but I'm not a Yasha Heifetz, no matter how much I practice. Okay. Note, synesthetic experiences do not require external signals, hence solubility is not synesthesia per se, but shares similar underlying mechanisms. Another brief film by David Eagleman.
Synesthesia,
I just view synesthesia as a different way of perceiving the world.
where people blend unrelated senses,
A's are always red, and M's are green.
so their letters and numbers have colors.
0 is white, 1 is black, 2 is kind of a light pink color, 2 is fuchsia.
Or they feel music as if it's floating around them.
I would feel things, I guess, starting from below me and behind me, spiraling up, going through this piano range, and then ending somewhere in the corner. When I used to do spelling bees, it was really easy for me to reproduce the spelling of the word based on the colors I would see. And when I was in 8th grade, I got second in the Texas spelling bee.
Applause. APPLAUSE.
Most of the papers in the literature just had a single subject in it. They would say, we have found a synesthete and here are her characteristics. So I thought, is there a way that we could actually get thousands of synesthetes? And so I turned to the internet.
David designed an online test to verify that someone has synesthesia, and it spread virally.
So at this point, I've interviewed and rigorously verified and have all the data on over 6,000 synesthetes. And that has really changed the field.
He now had a huge pool of subjects he could study with the latest scientific tools.
So it turned out that one of our synesthetes was getting married.
David saw a guerrilla science opportunity. The family would all be at the wedding, but what he really wanted was their DNA.
We crashed the wedding where a bunch of people were coming together for the family. And we showed up, and we had everybody spit the spit kit. And we left. And that was a great way to get a lot of data at once.
Next, he wanted to look inside the heads of synesthetes to see just how their brains worked.
We take someone with synesthesia, they go inside the FMRI machine, then we show them a video from Sesame Street. And we turn it into grayscale so there's no color involved. But there are lots of letters and numbers flying at them.
The fMRI gives David a map of what parts of their brain are active. When the synesthetes watched the video, they saw something very different from the rest of us.
Even though the cartoon was in black and white, I perceived the number as being in color.
So what clues did he find in the fMRI images?
What we seem to be finding is that the areas involved in letters and numbers are right next to the areas involved in colors and textures and spatial forms.
What David saw supports the idea of a kind of crosstalk between two adjacent but unrelated parts of the brain.
It appears that in synesthesia, there's just a slight tweak on that. Activity in some area will actually excite activity in a neighboring area. So this has led us to a new anatomical understanding of what's happening in synesthesia.
We wrote this paper up. It is available at Sage Open. If you're interested, I can send you a link to download the paper for free. It's a little tough slugging, but we sent it out before we sent it off to the publisher to a guy named Sean Day. Sean Day is listed as one of the top 3 researchers in synesthesia. And I never expected to hear back from him. And we asked to send him the paper and said, would he comment about the synesthesia part? The paper is 35 pages long. He sent me 45 pages of comments. Turns out he's an anthropologist, so we're kind of suspicious he must have seen some pretty weird stuff. He was very interested. We made our paper much better, much more accurate with regard to the synesthesia part. That said, our top 3 remote viewers I work routinely with, Joe McMonagle, Angela Ford, and Nevin Lance, on those online tests are all synesthets. 3 people do not make a model. But what's interesting is, particular Angela Ford sees colors in a lot of things, and it taught me to be a better monitor in her research. Because she'd say, oh, I see brown. And I used to think, well, dirt, okay, big deal, every place is dirty. But now I'm beginning asking her, well, what is it that makes you think it's brown? And then I get a synesthesia kind of response of things that were other things that had nothing to do with dirt that leads to that experience for her to be brown. It was really quite stunning to see in real time. I won't go through this slide. This just tells them how the information is brought up to cognition. And in the paper, we point out all the other models of parapsychology fit into our overall model, because we're running a little short of time. We can use this. What's great about this model is that it's ultimately testable. And we have people now lined up to do the synesthesia testing and other forms of testing to see whether our top people, in fact, fit this model. Sensory variability, synesthets, and finally people who can learn with implicit learning. Implicit learning means you're not cognitively aware of something, but you learn it nonetheless. We're all good at that at varying degrees. Body language is part of it, who knows what all. And just perhaps that part in there will yield another set of Joe McMonagles. So we're going to have access to David Eagleman's 6,000 synesthets to do some testing. We're working on that. So basically, I'm done, and thank you very much. We ran over a little bit of time, but I hope there's some time for, Mary, there's time for questions and so on. And you can direct them all to Russell. Yes, sir.
Your call name was Riverside Committee?
Yes.
Can you repeat the questions?
Who, which guy?
The guy from UC Riverside. He's on the Riverside Committee.
Oh, Riverside. His name is, he's a Bayesian statistician, head of the statistics department, and I'm blocking on his name. I'm trying to be clever. It'll come to me in a minute. Pardon me? No.
Larry?
Pardon me?
Larry?
No. I'll get it for you. Russ.
If the data is as extraordinary as you and I know that it is over a 20-year period, why did the CIA publish a report in 1995 for the purpose of permanently killing the programs?
Well, I didn't actually pay him to ask that question, but I'm really glad you did.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Russell said, since we've been doing this for 20 years with great data, how come the CIA shut us off? Well, there are 2, maybe 3 reasons. Part of it was my fault, I have to admit. As the program was coming to a close, running out of money, the U.S. House Senate Appropriations Committee put into that year's fiscal budget what's called a congressionally directed activity, which said to the CIA they are to conduct a 20-year retrospective analysis to determine whether or not this program was useful for intelligence or not. That was their tasking. And if they found it useful, they were to take over the program from DIA. What was really going on here, and it's part of the reason, I'm not saying it is the whole reason, maybe a small part, but it involves sex and intrigue. One of the staffers on the Appropriations Committee had a romantic entanglement with one of the female remote viewers at Fort Meade. And that was a huge problem, because this woman would run around and say, if I don't get my way, I'm calling my friend in the Senate. And she would do that, and this pipsqueak staffer would call the director of DIA and say, you better make my girlfriend happy, he wouldn't word it that way, or I'll cut off all your black money funding. Now, if I'd been the commander of DIA and some pipsqueak said, I would tell him to get lost and hang up on him, because he's not about to do that. But then it would filter down the chain, and our colleagues like Dale would have the heat poured on him to keep this woman happy. Now, what happened was, when the CIA was asked to review all this work, I was very friendly with the guy, I'll name, he gave me his card. His name was Andy Kirby from CIA Office of Science and Technology. Never heard about the stuff. He was a physical chemist. He was going to come to the Parapsychological Association. He was really excited about this. And one phone call, I said, you know, Andy, if you accept this program under the rules of the congressionally directed activity, you're asking for a world of hurt. And I described the romantic entanglement. And I said, don't believe a word I'm saying. Check it out for yourself. He called me a week later, and he said, Ed, you so underestimated the magnitude of that problem that I have been ordered by a higher pay grade than me never to speak to you again, and he hung up. That was the last conversation I had with him. Some of the real problems, though, which was the fact they lied like hell. They did, Angela Ford packed up something like 35 boxes of records, and we found out 2 years later, not one of them were opened in their investigation. Not one. And you'll be surprised, in the Stargate archive, we have a collection of papers from the DIA planning a 5-year program after our program was closed down because they knew the value of this stuff. So why the CIA closed it down, it's a big mystery. Yes, sir.
Well, along those lines, because I asked you that same question about why they didn't take it seriously. To me, obviously, they did take it seriously.
They saw people who used it did, sure.
Right, so they saw all this work being done by reputable scientists with integrity. So why wouldn't I, once I see that there's people lying about the outcome, why wouldn't I assume that they took it out of the hands of these reputable people, formed their own group, and handed it right to them and said, run with it? And the reason I say that is because Jacques Vallée in Forbidden Science wrote about how James McDonald came in, who was a physicist, and said, you and Alan Hynek must be crazy if you think the Air Force is giving you all the data here. There's got to be a control group somewhere else. And Jacques said, oh, I thought he was a loose cannon, until about 10 years later through the Freedom for Information Act, when I saw that he was right on the mark, that there was something going on.
Well, those of us that have worked as contractors with the federal government don't buy conspiracy theories very much because, frankly, how should I word this? Too damn stupid to pull off a good conspiracy. I spent 10 years after the program closed with some access to the admiral in the Pacific who was in charge of all of the remote viewing in the all the intelligence gathering in the Pacific, to spend 10 days out there with a promise of $10,000 plus expenses to write a report while sitting in her office to do the next step on counterterrorism to try to get this back. And it was killed at the Pentagon level. We spent roaming around the Pentagon. These people, the working people, loved it, just like you suggest. It's killed at the management level because they're all scared, for good reason. An undersecretary of the Air Force once said, and I quote, I believe in ESP is the work of the devil, kill that program. And they came and took some money back from us at SRI, and in fact, Dale Graff, who was a civilian working at Foreign Technology Division at the Air Force, had been given an award and a sabbatical for his remote viewing intelligence excellence, and they took that back. It so angered him, he quit and went to work for DIA. Yes?
Would the fall of the Soviet Union be the reason why the Russians stopped? Lost resources?
Sure.
The guy you worked with must have had a reason.
No, it didn't stop after the fall of the Soviet Union. The story's written in that book in some humorous terms. They kept on with it. I think Group 10,003 is now out of business because the guy who was running it simply retired.
And why did you not look at other things besides remote viewing? There's so many other parts of ESP that supposedly exist.
We did. One of the volumes in the Stargate archive is all about psychokinesis. It's about 350 pages. Yeah.
If I play devil's advocate for politicians, Clinton was under a lot of fire when he declassified this.
Pardon me?
President Clinton.
Yeah.
The CIA said it was worthless. If the CIA said it was worthwhile, Clinton could not be classified because he'd be impeached for high crime. Whatever. That's just a possible theory.
Well, he's saying, having to say that Clinton didn't support it because he was afraid of being impeached in this area. I know firsthand that one of Joe McMonagle's book was given to President Clinton and he liked it.
Well, what I'm saying is the public domain, if the CIA said that Clinton would be declassifying a dangerous weapon, sending it to the public.
All the stuff about Stargate came long after that in terms of its public domain. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the PK and precognition experiments you did?
PK's work?
And precognition.
Well, much of the work we did was precognitive work. That submarine example was precognitive work. In our laboratory now, that's all we do because it's cleaner. Someone can't complain about potential usage, leakage. I can tell you my own personal opinion, and not many people in my field agree with me. I'm not convinced about the reality of psychokinesis. And there's a long story there, which I don't want to go into. We can talk about it afterwards. Yes, sir.
Is there any research happening on remote viewing at the university level?
There's quite a bit of it in the UK. I'm not aware of any university level here. Russ, do you know anybody in the US? I don't think so. The UK has lots and lots and lots. And again, I'm not trying to sell you a book, but there's a whole section here what's going on in Australia in the universities and in the UK. The reason for that is one of our associates, Robert Morris, the late Bob Morris, was an American, held the first occupier of what was called the Kersler Chair of Parapsychology in the psychology department of the University of Edinburgh. He was there for 17 years. And when he first joined, the psych department was nervous about talking about parapsychology. And thanks to Bob, who spawned probably 50 PhDs in parapsychology across all of the UK today, and he became the president of the British Psychological Association, a very prestigious post as an American. And at the time of his death, University of Edinburgh Psychology Department was bragging about their Kersler unit doing top parapsychology work, thanks to Bob Morris. Yes?
Let's say that a remote viewer has a big decision. Can that remote viewer remote view themselves in the future to see what decision they made?
I don't know. We've never done something like that. It's a very creative idea. I don't know the answer to that. Yes, sir.
I guess slightly unrelated note. Some people I know have the ability to read people's emotional auras or some psychic ability to see what's going on with other people. Is that a function of the physics of how they get the information or the neurobiology of how it gets from where the person is into their brain to be able to
The question he's asking is, some people have an ability to read other people's emotions, I presume not standing in front of them.
energy
right?
fields.
Well, I don't know what that is, but I'm looking at you and seeing you're very unhappy or you're happy, or am I in the next room knowing about your emotion?
Be in the next room.
Okay.
Or take what we did at the beginning of the session here. Everybody concentrate.
Sure.
And just to develop the whole energy field for the group.
We have a paper that's coming out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. It's been accepted, it'll be in the next issue, claiming that the only form of informational psi is precognition. Because none of us know how to close the precognition door. If there's an answer book at the end of any study, no matter how complex, if somebody writes down an answer in the future, you today have, in principle, access to that information. Yes, sir.
When you talked to the Russian about the submarine, you said, it was a bunch of bull. I agree with you 100%. Did you ask him, put his feet to the fire a little bit and say, how did you figure out or come to the idea that it was compromised? Where did you get this idea?
No, my job there was not to be an interrogator of somebody. If I started questioning everything the former Soviets told me, I'd still be there. But I do have a funny story to tell you about that. I was sitting in a room with GRU generals and former Soviet army people, military people, and a few former Soviet civilians. They were all having lots of stuff to drink, too much food to eat. It was really quite of a joyous occasion. And it turns out in that room with former Soviet people, there was one and only one materialist atheist in the room. Yo! And they had a pretty good laugh over that. One thing that, talk about conspiracy. If you think the Soviet Union people were a bunch of godless atheists, you don't know the Soviet Union. They were not. Stalin attended church twice a week through the entire Soviet era. And I've gone down large boulevards leading to the Kremlin. There are no churches there. Yeah, if Soviet officials saw a church, they'd close it down. Go one block, and I've done it, on either side, there are churches there that don't even know the Soviet era actually happened. Now, what's more interesting to me is what I call the meta story. We had no problems in Russia getting top people like the equivalent of our chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. All these senior people falling all over themselves, begging to be part of this book. Why? They are steeped in a Russian Orthodox Church, all right? But the emotional religious aspect of that doesn't come from the church. It comes from shamanism in Central Asia. And if you're a shaman, you brag about being psychic. Here, if you're psychic, you get dragged through the mud. And as a result, I can now mention his name. Jack gave me permission. One of the heroes that led to this whole program was a guy named Jack Verona, PhD physicist, very instrumental in making this program go forward. In the CIA data dump of 89,000 pages, he's almost mentioned on half the pages of what he did for this program. He will not write anything in our books. He will not write a foreword. He finally, after I had lunch with him 6-7 months ago, I spent the whole day with him, we had a good time, but he will not write anything because, like Nancy Reagan was dragged through the mud when it was found out that she was interested in astrology. So our Judeo-Christian zeitgeist think this is horrible.
There's a Russian psychiatrist, her name's Olga Karatini. She would support exactly what you're saying. Her book is called Entering the Circle.
It's
she talks
weird.
about that whole
It's really weird.
Shamanic, yeah.
Pisses me off, you know. Like, we had some really high-level people. Russell will attest to that, and they will not, to use a spy term, come in from the cold. I'd sell a lot more of these books if I had some of the people I can name on the front page. Yes, sir, in the back.
What are some of the most effective things the remote viewers in training did to increase their ability?
This is a controversial question. An even more controversial. He asked, what did remote viewers do to increase their ability? I've examined probably 6 people from 1978 onward through to today. And you can do what's called a regression analysis and say what their outcome is in each remote viewing, and it's variable and all over the place. And much to my surprise, the good news is they don't lose their ability. The bad news is they don't improve. Why? I have no idea, and it drives me crazy. I'd love to figure out why. You had a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Would you consider the Manhattan Project a conspiracy?
A Manhattan Project conspiracy? You mean building the atomic bomb? No, why?
It wasn't? Oh, okay.
Why?
Well, it was just kept secret.
Oh yeah, not every secret is a conspiracy. It wasn't actually very secret. I mean, by the time it exploded in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Russians knew all about it.
Okay, I was just trying to understand what your comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I can speak to the point this gentleman raised. I worked for about 5 years with a remote viewer, and he worked at NASA, and the way it happened for me was that I was at SRI International when Hal and Russell were doing their project, and I was a technical proofreader for reports, and my office was below their office, and I used to start seeing objects passing through my mind. And one day I was in their office and I saw the objects on cardboard. That opened up the door for me to know that something was paranormal. And I met a fellow who was trained by Ed Dames. And the way that he encouraged me was that we would work for about 2 hours at a time. And he would say, just keep telling me what you're seeing or feeling or sensing. No monitoring, no censoring, and it became so gut level, and I was about 75% accurate.
Very good.
And it's amazing.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your editing job. I'm now reading most of those reports you've edited, and they're very good.
That was my profession.
Let's talk afterwards about Ed Dames.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, you showed a picture of the lady who went to the site in Houston by the river. You showed a picture of her to Mr. McGonigal.
Yeah.
Did you try it the other way around, where, you know, whether he knew her or not, where maybe she knew him or knew what he looked like, and was trying to beam that back to him, and he never saw anything about her? I mean, what there's some element there that seems sort of mysterious, like how, if he's never met this woman and she's someplace, how, by looking at a picture of her, did he all of a sudden be able to tune in on her wavelength to get what she was beaming out versus her tuning in on him and sending it to him? It seems like there might be an ability both ways that have to be in sync, otherwise it won't work. You know, like if this person who's sending it or viewing it doesn't have some ability too, then maybe, you know, maybe it would broaden the number of people that could receive it.
An excellent question, but what you saw here, which we've learned since then, is a bit of a misnomer. I won't call it, it's misleading. One of the early questions that Hal and Russ had to answer is a sender necessary? Do we have to have a witting or unwitting person sending the information back? The answer is clearly no. In fact, the experiment that we just did with Lori, she was the outbound experimenter. I never asked the remote viewer, please tell me what Lori is up to right now. What I said was, please access and describe the place you will be taken to 1 hour from now. She was out of the question. Sometimes she poured liquid nitrogen out, and sometimes she didn't. So we actually paid for a study at Edinburgh University in a procedure called the Gonsfeld, which is like remote viewing in an altered state. And we asked the musical question, does a sender matter? If the remote viewer is blind to whether there's a sender there or not, it doesn't matter. They get good data regardless. If they know that somebody they brought is a sender, they get better data, and that can be explained in what's called psychosocial actions, that they feel more comfortable and relaxed knowing someone in the next room is sending something to them. It's a great question, though, with a complex answer, I'm afraid. Yes, sir?
We also talked about gravity, and I know that physicists think that gravity is weaker than it should be. It should be significantly stronger to match the power of some of the other basic forces. And so people have talked about the possibility that due to multiple dimensions, that gravity is diluted in more than the 3 or 4 dimensions that we have access to. And that's why it's weaker to what we perceive. But we perceive it through curved space-time that, you know, 2 massive bodies draw each other together. And that's a sense that is not one of the 5 that we have, but we still feel gravity, we feel its effects. And so from some of your middle slides that you were talking about some of these issues, could you expand a little bit on some of the actual results that people have found from multidimensional research or anything like that?
First off, we had one of the pioneers in that regard of proposing multi-dimensions as a way of explaining psi. Russell and his colleagues published a paper when, early on, with Elizabeth Rauscher on 8-dimensional space. Since that time, they carried forward a guy by the name of Bernard Carr, wrote an entire chapter in this book of multi-dimensions. He was Stephen Hawking's first postdoc, and he's a cosmologist. And so he expanded on that earlier work to describe it. And I'll be blunt, I haven't a clue what he wrote. I do not understand his paper, but it's in there. It involves some rather obscure mathematics and what have you. I don't know if there is any data whatsoever that supports the idea of multidimensionality in that regard. Russell and I attended a symposium hosted by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in San Diego in 2011. And there were a bunch of mainstream people talking about retrocausation. Can something in the future influence the present? And all of them said, we have no data to support it. Well, there were a few parapsychologists there who said, yo, we think we have data that supports that. But that's not a physics measurement. So as far as I know, there's no physics measurement that demands higher dimensions. Now, string theory, of course, has 11. It's not called M theory. So there are all kinds of great things. The string theorists like Brian Greene there, he said, if you didn't know gravity existed, but you knew M theory, you would predict gravity must exist. Well,
and yet they still
all
haven't measured gravity waves. They haven't been able to find them, even though they think they
They're launching a satellite looking for gravity waves, but no one has yet come up with them. Although my colleague Joe Depp has an answer of how gravity waves might start. And it involves the Higgs boson field, and you don't want to know. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question about when Stargate actually began, or what led up to it beginning, and the same for the Soviet program. How did they both seem to start at the same time, or is that just, that's not true? How did you find out about each other? How did this all come about that you were both spying on each other through similar programs?
That's a good question. I was just reading now from the CIA released documents. The intelligence community knew about the Soviets' interest in this field dating back to the mid-60s. How the Stargate program got started was primarily Russell Targ, with the main leader on that, with his colleague Hal Puthoff, started, I think, initially beginning in 71, 72 was it? Yeah, beginning first in 72. They were spying on us. I've had some chance to view formerly classified work in Russia talking about our program, and I was able to display to them about our classified stuff talking about that. They had the same problems we had. Everybody was trying to put them out of business. So we were using each other to justify staying in business, which we now have lots of drinking and laughing about it now. Yes?
When you were considering media for transmission in physics, do you consider quantum entanglement? And if so, what came about?
One of the happy buzzwords understood by almost nobody outside of physics, but that doesn't stop people from talking about it. It turns out quantum entanglement is just a fancy way of saying correlation. And I'm writing a paper that you can demonstrate either classically or quantum mechanically, you cannot get information from a correlation. Because you have to assume the correlation is in place, and that's not always true. Let's suppose we each have children swinging on an adjacent swing, back and forth. You push your kid, I push my kid, and they're swinging correlated, right? In an airless, frictionless world, starving kids. We cut the thing in half, and you carry your kid to New York, and my kid here. Your kid moves forward, my kid moves forward. I know instantaneously your kids move forward. Except you took your kid out for pizza. So it wouldn't work. And there's a name for that in quantum mechanics. It's called environmental decoherence. You took your kid for a pizza. So the only way I can guarantee that this correlation is in place is you call me up and say, my kid's swinging. Then I know. But I need that extra piece of information. That's why you cannot, quantum entanglement will not answer ESP. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
So I was a little hesitant to ask because I'm not terribly scientific, but I was trying to follow what you were saying and the film clips that we saw. And there was one that talked about reverse, and was it philosophy? Did I miss the word? Reverse philosophy. Oh, when Brian Greene was talking about well, that came in the next one late.
Velocity.
Velocity.
Velocity. You know, this piece of glass is flying out this way, they turn around ready to go backwards.
Now it makes sense, but so the other thing you said was when there's entropy, there's from still to scatter, and what I was understanding, either you or the film saying, that we don't notice the still as much as we notice the scatter. Was that the idea?
Oh, when you were talking about flashing lights
and
movement,
yeah. That's right. I understand.
That more.
So, and that is why part of why we don't notice the physics of the reverse velocity.
Not quite. It's a little mixed up there.
Yeah,
all I was saying was that ESP seems to act like all of our other sensory systems. ESP is sensitive to things that are changing and not sensitive to when they're not changing. In this case, the thing that's changing is called entropy. But flashing light, you can see that more easily than a steady state one, in which case that's electric E&M waves. And same with hearing, and same with smelling, all that stuff. All of our sensory systems are more sensitive to change, and even our ESP sensory system, whatever that turns out to be, is also. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. I just happened to think of something when you're saying that, and I don't know whether there was that machine where they were doing the remote, I don't know if it's remote viewing, but it monitors changes in worldwide events. A machine that actually, it monitors random, yes. Where that is just a machine, it has nothing to do with human input, well, actually it does, but in large masses of, or groups of people can influence whatever is out there to produce an effect thousands of miles away in this machine. Can register like 9/11, what happened, and they notice, I mean, I don't know, does this machine always?
Quite familiar with that.
But that is also in a way, it seems like somewhat related to cognition, because it's something out there that it's grabbing, produced by everybody's mind or whatever.
The program you're speaking about is called the Global Consciousness Project, put forward by one of our friends, Thank you. When you get to my age, I can't remember my own name, unless Roger Nelson.
He gave a talk here recently.
Did he?
About 6 months ago.
It's the Global Consciousness Project, and the idea behind it is exactly what you said, that these electromechanical things scattered all over the world with certain events which are ill-defined somehow influence these things, that these things feel our pain, if you will. The problem is, many of us have been very skeptical about that whole thing, and his partner in this work is a guy named Peter Benchell, just changed his view about the whole thing. He said it's an interesting project, it has nothing to do with global consciousness. I'm quoting him, not there. Did you know that Peter did that?
I did not.
Yeah. Yes?
I just want to make sure I understood what you said earlier about McMonagle remote viewing the scene that was ultimately chosen for the CBS segment, that he remote viewed hours prior to that?
Yeah.
Like from his hotel room or something?
Precognition, right?
So he was just going through the motions for the sake of?
Yeah.
Okay. Had nothing to do with the woman or the...
Years later, he told that producer about it and it just blew him out of the water. So, yes, sir.
Were you able to find anything that blocked the remote viewing of the Soviets, and if
I
so,
wish.
you didn't?
No. One of the things we did, in our building at SRI, we had a special classified room, which was protected from anything leaking out. And we'd go down there and say, here are 4 envelopes with 4 pictures in them. When we leave, put one of them envelopes in the middle of the table and we'll penetrate your walls. Which we routinely could do, which terrified them and kept the money for it. What we didn't tell them was, if Precognition is acting, they gave us the envelope, we'd go upstairs to the remote viewer and say, here's your picture. He didn't have to go into the room at all. He could look into his future and see that. Yes, ma'am.
What about with animals? You remember the elephants who fled just before the tsunami in Sri Lanka, I believe, or Indonesia? Yeah. Do you ever do mass experiments with animals? Or?
No, there have been some done with animals. The problem is you don't know who's psychic, the animal or the researcher. And that's a serious problem, actually. I don't mean to make fun of it. It's a terrible, difficult problem. Although Rustar just left, his daughter knew American Sign Language very well and worked with Penny Patterson, who worked with Coco the gorilla. And we decided, wouldn't it be cool, since we can communicate with Coco the gorilla, that Penny Patterson would go out and hide some random place, and Elizabeth Targ would communicate with Coco the gorilla and tell us where Penny was. Well, Penny, she went to talk to Penny, and Penny was very wise and said, look, I've got one possibility, a talking gorilla, and now you want me to tell people I got a psychic talking gorilla? Very wise in her part. Okay, it's getting late, guys. How about one more question and we can call it an evening, huh? We're calling it an evening. Thank you all.